Todd Dunn here on January 3, 2021. This is the first in a series of videos that I'm working on about the historical development of Acadia National Park. And in this video, I want to go from the very beginnings of the park, maybe even from a little bit before the park was founded, up until World War II. And basically what I'm doing is looking back at historical references that I have been able to find online primarily about Mount Desert Island, Acadia National Park, and the development of the park. In particular, I am going to be using a series of maps that I found of Mount Desert Island and Acadia National Park on the Library of Congress page, and also information that I've been able to glean by looking through the Hancock County Registry of Deeds to look for transactions that involved sale or gift of land to the federal government. So those are my data sources. So the map beside me shows you Acadia National Park today. All the shaded areas of the park. There are three main areas for the park: Mount Desert Island and some of the islands around it, the Schoodic Peninsula to the east, and to the southwest, Isle of Ho. But Acadia National Park has not always been that big and that widespread. In fact, its original origins were much more humble. To get to that, though, I guess what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the events that led up to the initial formation of the park. Starting in the middle 1800s, Mount Desert Island began to attract tourists. They were called Rusticators, and they were people that came from the big cities to the south, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and they came up here to get away from the city and experience nature. And initially, they would come up here, rent a room, and pay board in someone's home, and then spend their time exploring the island. And over time, the local people started catering to them, expanded their homes by adding on guest rooms, and eventually they started building hotels and inns to accommodate these visitors. And the number of visitors gradually increased over time. And in addition to the Rusticators, more general tourism started. Now, these were people who would come up here either by taking a steamer from Portland or Boston, or by taking the train up to Trenton, which was the closest railroad stop, and then boarding a steamer to cross Frenchman Bay to the island. There was also another class of tourists that started coming, and those were the wealthy. And in the latter part of the 19th century, the wealthy gradually formed, if you will, summer colonies in the towns of Northeast Harbor, Seal Harbor, and Eden. Those are shown there on the map. And those people were interested in nature here and in preservation of the land, and they formed what are called village improvement societies to encourage the development of public space around the villages. And also, incidentally, things like the Kibo Valley Golf Course and the Northeast Harbor Golf Course, and perhaps yacht clubs. So not all public spaces. Well, while this was going on and the wealthy were building their summer cottages, which is a sort of euphemism for mansions, mostly in Eden, Northeast Harbor, Seal Harbor, and to a lesser extent in Southwest Harbor, there was considerable development going on for the other tourists. A lot of hotels were built, and this concerned the village improvement societies and some of the wealthy people that supported them, because that development was encroaching on the nature that they wanted to preserve. For example, in the 1880s, you can see in these pictures, a cog railway was built from the shore of Eagle Lake to the top of Green Mountain, which is now called Cadillac Mountain, and a hotel was built on the top of Cadillac Mountain, or Green Mountain then. And the hotel was short-lived because, like most of the wooden hotels of that period, was rather susceptible to fire and burned down. The cog railway ran from 1883 to 1890, before the crash of the early 90s cut into tourism, and business declined, and they shut it down and eventually sold off their rolling stock to a cog railway in New Hampshire, the Mount Washington Cog Railway. And I believe at least one of the engines is still there. So these village improvement societies were disturbed by the development, and they wanted to limit it if possible. So as a consequence of that, in 1901, the Hancock County Trustees of Public Lands came into existence. Now you might think that this is a county board, perhaps with elected members, but no, this is a private corporation formed by some of the wealthy people from the Northeast Harbor, Seal Harbor, and Eden village improvement societies, with the sole purpose of acquiring land and making it available to the public for recreation and limiting or minimizing development on that land. And the Hancock County Trustees of Public Lands, over the next 15 years, gradually bought up land and prevented development on that land. Now, I don't know if they initially intended to, but in 1916 the decision was made to donate that land to the United States federal government if the land could be turned ultimately into a national park. But initially the people involved, which included Charles Eliot, the former president of Harvard University, who was a summer resident of Northeast Harbor, George Dorr, a resident of Eden, which became Bar Harbor in 1919, and John Rockefeller Jr., who was a resident of Seal Harbor. These are all relatively wealthy people, particularly Rockefeller, and they arranged to donate approximately 5,000 acres of land to the federal government. And because it was a time-consuming task requiring congressional action to create a national park, they convinced the president to use his executive powers under the Antiquities Act to create a national monument. And consequently, in February 1916, the Sieur Dumont's National Monument came into existence, and it's shown in this map here. Now, the National Monument included the most of Cadillac Mountain on the north and west, and other lands around Eagle Lake and extending down to Jordan Pond, as you can see in the map. But it did not include the summit of Cadillac Mountain. And at that time there was no easy road up to the top of Cadillac Mountain. The cog railway had more than 25 years before been disassembled. But I gather there was a wagon road that you could take up, but it was pretty rough. But their intent by making these lands into a national monument was to prevent future development on the land. The national monument continued for 3 years with very little change until 1919, when they finally prevailed upon the Congress to pass the necessary legislation to create a new national park using the land from the Sieur de Monts National Monument. And that national park was named Lafayette National Park. So it came into existence in 1919, in February. So that land was now a national park, and it was under the direction of the brand new National Park Service. Well, from the formation of the national park through the 20s, there was some gradual addition to the park by donation of lands from various people. And there were several fairly substantial donations, the biggest of which was over on the Schoodic Peninsula, when an heir to an early settler on the Schoodic Peninsula who had acquired a good deal of land over there donated basically the southern half of the Schoodic Peninsula to to Lafayette National Park with one condition. This particular heir had moved to Britain and was married to a British officer who had, it's reported, a relatively low opinion of the French and objected to donating land to a park named after a Frenchman, Lafayette. So the condition of the donation was that the park be renamed. And in 1929, coincident with that donation, Lafayette National Park was renamed to Acadia National Park. Another large donation was there on the west side of Somme Sound, which is the body of water up the middle of the island, that's saltwater, and that was Acadia Mountain, which was donated privately by a family whose parents had settled in Northeast Harbor and had loved the area. And there were a number, as you can see there in yellow, a number of other additions to the park. One fairly significant one was that they were able to acquire the actual summit of Cadillac Mountain, which had by this time been renamed from Green Mountain. And in the southern part of the island, the first little block of land was donated to the park, and that is right down in the seawall area. And in fact, I walked over there just a week ago to take a look at the old homesteaders cemetery there. And that land was actually initially donated to the park in 1919, but because of the fact that the donation came after a homesteader died and left the land to his heirs, there were overlapping claims to the land, and it took quite a while for all of the claims to be resolved and the donations to the park to be finalized. So that shows how the park was added to from its initial founding as a national park in 1919 up until 1931, when this map was produced. And you can see the park grew fairly substantially, largely due to the addition of land on the Schoodic Peninsula, the land on the southeast coast of Mount Desert Island, which is where the main part of the Park Loop Road is now, and Acadia Mountain, and some other land a little bit to the west of the original park. But other than that, it was just small additions. The big changes happened between 1930 and the beginning of World War II. And I need to talk about some of the players there. During the 20s and 30s, John D. Rockefeller Jr. of Seal Harbor and New York spent a lot of time on Mount Desert Island and devoted a lot of resources to the island. And during the 20s and 30s, he went on a program of building carriage roads on the island so that you could take a horse-drawn carriage and ride around the island and see various vistas. And the carriage roads were constructed to take maximum advantage of the views. And in some places, the trees were cut down to provide views, and then the areas were replanted, but with native plants designed to maintain the views over time. And as the carriage roads were completed in various parts of the island, Rockefeller donated those lands to the national park. And he also was actively involved in buying up land on all parts of the island and donating it to the national park. Not everybody on the island was in favor of really expanding the national park to all parts of Mount Desert Island. So Rockefeller worked through proxies to acquire the land, and a number of those proxies, as far as I can tell from looking at the deeds, were George Dorr, who was the first superintendent of the park from 1919 until his death in 1944, a fellow named Ben Worcester, and a few other people. And I deduce that simply from looking at the deeds, where those individuals would buy a piece of land, and within a few days the land would be transferred to Rockefeller, who would then donate it to the national park. And the prices recorded in the transfers were pretty nominal. The highest one I found was $2,800 for a block of land with about a half mile of waterfront near the Bass Harbor Head Lighthouse. So that is how the park developed. And if we look at the map showing the changes from 1931 to 1942, which means that this map was actually put together just before the U.S. entered World War II, you can see that a very substantial additions were made to the park. And included in those additions were some, if you will, sort of wheeling and dealing done by Rockefeller and George Dorr, the park superintendent. Rockefeller wanted to buy up the land on Otter Cliffs, which I've indicated the location of here, and use that land to extend the Park Loop Road. But unfortunately, during World War I, the United States Navy had built a radio station there to communicate with Navy ships in the Atlantic Ocean. And the Navy felt that that radio station was essential for their continued operations. And they didn't want to shut it down. So Rockefeller made a deal with the Navy and with the National Park that if he could find an alternate location for the radio station that was suitable to the Navy, would they move and transfer their land on Otter Cliffs to the National Park in exchange for other land. Well, after some negotiation, the Navy agreed to that, and Rockefeller was able to convince them that Big Moose Island at the southern tip of the Schoodic Peninsula would be an ideal location for their radio station. and the Navy agreed. Well, Rockefeller was pretty far-sighted in that he anticipated that at some point the Navy would relinquish ownership of the new radio station and the land would revert to the national park. So he used his own resources to build the principal buildings for the new Navy establishment on the Scudic Peninsula. And he built them in the style of the carriage houses that he had built for his carriage roads. And in 1935, the new establishment for the Navy's radio station was completed on Big Moose Island on the Scudic Peninsula, and a land exchange was done between the Navy and the National Park. The National Park owned the land on the Scudic Peninsula, and the Navy owned Otter Cliffs. So Otter Cliffs came into the National Park, and a bit of land on the Scudic Peninsula on Big Moose Island switched over to Navy ownership. And at that point, the road along the shore, the loop road, was extended around Otter Cliffs. Essentially all traces of the former Navy radio station were obliterated, and the national park was expanded. And that southeast part of the park basically came into more or less the shape it's in now. The other big expansion in the park was on the western side of the island. As you can see, we'd gone from just the area of Acadia Mountain along the western shore of Somme Sound to a lot of land extending all the way over to and past Long Pond, which was also known as Great Pond then, to the extreme western shore of the island at Pretty Marsh. And as a consequence of that expansion and the expansion in the Otter Cliffs area, during the 30s, the first two campgrounds in the national park were built. In the Otter Cliffs area, they built the first loop of the Blackwoods campground, and over on the western side of the island, in the southwest part of the island, in the seawall area, they built the Seawall campground. And by the beginning of World War II, there were two loops of camping at Seawall. So that basically shows you the expansion of the park from its formation as the Sieur de Monts National Monument in 1916 to the beginning of World War II. I should point out a couple of additional details. Now, most of the land, particularly in the western part of the island, was just purchased from the homesteaders and their heirs who lived in the area. It was done piecemeal, very small plots of land. Now, the Hancock County Trustees of Public Lands were still active in buying land and transferring it to the national park. And as a result of this, if you look at the western part of the island, you'll notice that there are lots of little inliers in the park, bits of land that were not sold to the park, where people held out and wouldn't sell their land. And there are still some of those inliers, and development of the park now is largely centered around acquiring inliers when the land becomes available, and also other expansions. But they're much smaller than the expansions that went on in the 30s, which is when the largest expansion of the park occurred. Okay, that covers pretty much what I wanted to say about Acadia National Park's founding and its initial growth from the approximately 5,000 acre Sieur de Monts National Monument to about 35,000 acres at the beginning of World War II. And in the next video, we'll be talking about the development of the park following the war. Well, I hope you found it interesting. Thanks for watching. And if you enjoyed it, please give me a thumbs up. If you haven't, please think about subscribing to my channel and clicking the notification bell so you'll find out when my next video is coming out. Thanks again for watching.